Just to begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I sit, the Waldron people, and recognise their continuing connection to the lands and waterways. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And as I began with, it's particularly pertinent given that we're talking about the legacy today of folklore. Folklore that's perhaps particularly significant when we think about that unique melting pot of Ballarat and the gold rush, where of course we have the Indigenous communities well established here, as it had been for many tens of thousands of years, and a sudden influx of people from all over the world, people who brought their folklore, their traditions and their culture and heritage with them. And it created perhaps a unique synergy in Ballarat, and this is something that's represented in the surviving remnants of folklore, folk magic practices and so on that are left in old buildings, concealed objects, and of course marks on the wall. I'm just going to switch over at the moment to show a few slides, and I'll be sort of on and off showing slides and speaking in person today as we go along. So I'm hoping at the moment you can both hear me and see some slides that I'm putting up. And here we have from down near Geelong what's called a hexafoil and spectacle marks, which we'll talk about shortly. So I've got this extended quote here from Emma Wilby. I'm not going to read all of it out, so don't worry, you won't get death by PowerPoint. But what she's talking about here is this interesting thing of trying to grapple with a different kind of worldview. But when we talk about people from the rural sector of Europe in the early 19th century, we're talking about people who are quite deeply entrenched in a very rich living tradition of folklore. And of course, I quite often talk about Jill Blee's work, for instance, looking at many Irish immigrants to the gold rush being convinced they brought the little people with them, that traditions of Banshee were quite strong here in the gold rush. There's something else that's also particularly pertinent, which Emma Wilby also brings up in her work on the witch trials in Britain, and that is that we tend to try and construct an artificial divide between Orthodox Christianity and pagan practice. And what you have instead is a kind of synergy where surviving, living, growing and evolving folklore is deeply entwined with people's Christian beliefs, particularly rural Catholicism in parts of Ireland, Scotland, and of course France and so on. If you want a parallel today, you can look at things like a lot of the symbolism associated with Cinco de Mayo in Mexico, for example, where you have a synergy of different belief systems that have come together to create a uniquely vibrant folkloric practice. And it's perhaps particularly pertinent when you think of it in terms of the 19th century, which is sort of a strong transition period for that rural sector, where we start having education moving out to the masses, and also the mass uprooting of people from the countryside into urban areas, into factories, and the breaking up those connections to the land and traditional practices in which those sort of folkloric traditions are based. And George Ewart Evans talks about it as an interesting kind of synergy where people become sort of torn between folkloric practices that have a deep emotional hold on the psyche, yet at the same time raised in an Enlightenment education system that sees such things as primitive superstition. In terms of these sorts of practices, as George Ewart Evans says here, the location of these objects within houses and the primary literary sources relating to witch bottles in particular indicate that at least some of these artefacts were concealed to ward off witches and other perceived evil influences such as ghosts and demons. And this evidence suggests that popular beliefs and practices concerning fear of witchcraft and other malign forces changed little after the period of the witch trials, except in minor details right through into the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's interesting, if any of you have been to the UK and visited old churches, you'll find they're often covered in these kinds of symbols. Many old houses will have these carvings all over the walls, and they're, in a sense, a fact of life. They're often proudly marked in homes as a way of connecting people to heritage and history. And this sits a bit more awkwardly in Australia, where in the end dominant Anglo-Celtic population, we don't tend to tie our heritage back to the pre-industrial era in quite the same way. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things we're looking for. We're talking to a large extent about what's known as apotropaic marks. And these are symbols and patterns etched into the fabric of a building with the intention of warding off evil influences. Perhaps one of the longest legacies of this, of course, is having a horseshoe up at your home. And that funny feeling you can get where the horseshoe's upside down, feeling awkward, even though you don't believe it still has an emotional impact on you. I should note these are different to carpenter's marks and mason's marks, which are used to mark who completed a particular building, though it also has its own folkloric legacy. The shape of the marks are tied to family heritage and tradition, and they often have multi-generational connections to it and deep symbolism applied. This is an example of a mason's mark here in the Yarrawee, for instance. And there'd be a history and culture attached to that particular symbolism that's held by the mason who crafted that bluestone. So here's an example of apotropaic marks here from a windowsill. And now this one here in Creswick, you can see the VV symbol there representing the Virgin Mary. You can see a pentacle and other symbols which have been marked again at thresholds, places where you enter and exit buildings. Hexafoils and daisy wheels. This is quite common. This is actually goes right back to the pre-Roman times. It has tied to symbolism of the sun wheel and Celtic mythology. It's often referred to as the marigold in medieval British traditions, and that links it again to the Virgin Mary. And certainly perhaps one of the most recognisable and spectacular of these kinds of marks. Now, many of these marks are made with what's called a race knife, and I'm going to just show you one in a moment. Stop sharing options. I'm hoping you're seeing my screen right now. So I'm hoping you can see this quite clearly in your screen. This is what's called a race knife. It's a device that's not very common today, but was a standard piece of equipment in things like shipbuilding and carpentry. And you can see how it has 2 points akin to a compass that you can adjust. And its purpose was used for marking where you're, of course, cutting and joining wood, but also to write information like where a particular barrel is, what it contains. Most of these marks are made with what's called with race knives, not dissimilar to these. And again, it's that interesting little bit of common tools that were well known in the period, but today have largely been forgotten. One of the perhaps more ominous symbols in contemporary folklore, thanks mainly to Hollywood. I'm just going to switch back to sharing screen for a moment. Is that of the pentacle or pentagram. Again, Hollywood's given us this whole tradition of occultism and horror movies associated with it, but that meaning is quite contemporary and recent. The early church, indeed right up to the medieval period, became a symbol of the 5 wounds of Christ, also a symbol of the 5 elements, and of course a symbol of the golden mean. Again, a symbol of protection on homes, in windowsills, fireplaces and other locations. Witch bottles is another, and I'm going to show you an example of one. Now, it's interesting, if you look in this picture of a bottle here, these are some that were quite custom made, actually made in Germany and exported to Britain. You can see in the X-ray of it, and recently Sari Holbrook, a colleague of mine in Britain, did an opening of a 16th century witch bottle. And they're typically filled with things like fingernails, hair, things that connect very strongly to a person, urine, and nails or pin. And in the surviving fragments we have from this period, including some from Australia we'll look at later, the belief was that this would protect against pain of childbirth. It's something usually inserted into the brickwork of fireplaces or into the wall of a home. What's interesting in Australia, they typically were made using existing bottles, whereas in Europe they were made with custom-made clay pieces. So I'm just going to switch back for a moment and I'll show you one. And so you might be able to see here a bottle with old urine and pins in it. Again, it gives you an insight into the kinds of anxieties that people of this time had. Things like pain in childbirth, infant mortality were quite critical aspects of people's lived experiences. And it's, like an old axiom in anthropology, the things we ritualize give us insight into the points of anxiety in our culture and community. And typically the greater the anxiety, the greater we attempt to ritualize these kinds of practices. Showing you again another image. Spectacle marks to ward off the evil eye, again typically found on windowsills and mantelpieces. Concentric circles, which is the literature of the early 19th century. And if you go and have a look at the George Ewart Evans collection, where he has interviews with people who are quite elderly in the 1950s, the concentric circles represented the Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Another common one is ritual burn marks or taper marks made by holding a candle against a central pillar and burning a hole and then digging it out with a spoon and continuing burning until you have a thumbprint-sized hole in which you can put your finger. Again, the literature from the period talks about this as a vehicle to inoculate buildings against fire. It was also used as a way of cleansing stables, which were the lodge rooms of the Horseman's Word, which is a movement akin to Freemasonry but focused in horse husbandry instead. People who practiced the Horseman's Word were known as horse whisperers, if you've heard that phrase. But I'm probably guessing you've only heard that phrase because of the movie. Concealed objects. This is a particularly fascinating one. Objects that are hidden in the wall of a home. So I'm going to show some examples of this in my little box of things that we've located. Let's bring you up again to, yeah. One of the most common ones you'll find are shoes. So here's one found in a building in Ballarat. Typically shoes at the end of their life that are in not a great state. There's a really good one I found in Camp Street recently. It had its own little separate compartment made for it in the floor, which they still have there at the building. They're looking at some way of displaying it. Shoes are quite significant. They're a deeply personal object, and they were kind of unique in clothing in that it holds the shape of the wearer. And there's a few traditions associated with shoes. One is that the shoes want to stay together. So while one shoe's on the wall, so long as the home stands, it should protect the life of the person who owns the shoe. Secondly, because the shoe maintains the shape of the owner, it was thought that spirits would look and inhabit the shoe and then could be safely walled up in the home. And this also relates to a way of thinking about your home where it becomes like an extension of yourself, an extension of the family, deeply personally connected. Other things you can find are corn dollies, such as this one. Now, this is sort of a traditionally made corn dolly, but as we'll see later on in some of my images, you'll also find traditional porcelain dolls, sometimes concealed in the wall of the home. And again, I find this interesting. At the time, it would have been as a symbol of protection for an ill child. Today, people see it and they're like, oh, no, I'm not touching that. There's horrible spirits and ghosts attached to it. So I find it fascinating sometimes the way in which folkloric heritage has become so transformed by Hollywood. Of course, other things you might find, hagstones. Again, believed to ward off evil spirits. And an old persistent folkloric tradition that stones that have a natural hole through them was something that you could look through and see into the spirit world if you had the gift. Little personal items of jewellery like this little owl. These are just things that have been found in homes around Ballarat. And again, things that leave their legacy. I'm just going to show a little image again. And here we go. So these things are typically placed in particular compartments that are often made for the purposes of protecting the home. So you can see here in the fireplace, common to find shoes. There's a place out in Newstead that had nearly 40 shoes hidden in spots like this, little compartments made through the hotel, what is now the Railway Hotel when it was renovated. This was found under the floor of the Ballarat Steakhouse, and when it was being renovated to become the Ballarat Steakhouse, obviously, it actually had gas lines out to the front. Now, I think this wasn't so much a ritual protective space, but rather it was used in the initiation ceremonies of the Lodge of Oddfellows. And anyone in the audience who's a Freemason might have some idea about the purposes of that sort of concealed space. Another one, and Ballarat's quite unique in this respect, are soot marks. Now, in terms of 18th and 17th century beliefs in Britain, the soot marks on the roofs were things you could do to protect against nightmares. And the belief was it would protect people's spirits and would absorb negative feelings. And if we look at this particular example here, you can see in the symbolism again, protective marks again acting a bit like, you know, pop culture interpretations of a dream catcher. Marks on hinges, again to bar doorways with X's carved in with a file. And another one, of course, is foundation sacrifices, which is burying a cat with often with a witch bottle or some other objects in a box underneath the hearthstone of a fireplace. So where did all this come from? This sort of research has been quite prolific in Britain now for a long time. However, Ian Evans wrote his PhD thesis on surviving practices in Australia and was able to receive funding from the University of Hertfordshire and the Society for Vernacular Architecture to do a large-scale study of Australia. And we've done 3 field seasons so far. Firstly in Tasmania and in Western Victoria with myself, where we went out and visited 40 properties across Western Victoria from the 1840s, 1850s, looking for examples of these kinds of practices. However, there's been other finds made across New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia. So this was conducted in 2019, and we went out and visited these amazing old buildings and mansions and investigated outbuildings looking for these kinds of practices surviving in the architecture. So here's some examples. This is a gorgeous hexafoil at Glenormistan College in the stables there. An odd quirk in Victoria is all the hexafoils found in Victoria had 12 petals instead of the usual 6. And again, we have no idea why. We speculate perhaps it might be because they're done by the same person. We don't know. Yet nonetheless, that was what was found in Victoria, which is quite different to the symbols found in Tasmania, which were more prolific, but interestingly followed the usual pattern of 6 petals. Glenormistan College again, the 3 concentric rings carved into the wall. Down here near Geelong, Pentacle marks, and again 12 petals. In Smeaton, at Anderson's Mill, there's an enormous hexafoil carved in the 2nd floor just near the stairs and the window. And again, 12 petals. And you see it's been painted over. People haven't known what it was, but it was still there, leaving its mark. And you can see here in the windowsill, there's the hexafoil, and above it, 3 concentric marks. Now, it's interesting with the marks, tradition was with a hexafoil that you don't complete it, because to complete it is an affront to God, so you always leave it with one or another part of a petal unfinished. Now, this is an interesting angle. This is from Drummond Street, Ballarat, and why I bring this up, this is a lot easier to do when I have an audience and can get a response from people. This is contemporary. This was found in a shop on Drummond Street when they raised the carpets. And you can, when looking at the design of this, it's very much a contemporary Wiccan symbol that combines bits of Germanic folk practices with the pentacle, having a sort of miniature hexafoil in the middle, and then with what looks like Viking runes in the centre of that. And it's perhaps an interesting little notion that when you're looking for these, the question of dating is really important. In this case, the simple syncretic nature of the symbol indicates that it's probably dating from the 1970s. Yet, That being said, in terms of its significance, one thing I've noted with this is, why does antiquity itself necessarily equate to sacrality with these kinds of images? It certainly meant a lot to the people who did it, who certainly took their time drawing these symbols. Guildford had a unique collection of burn marks and marks on the walls at what was formerly a Cobb and Co station. Our suspicion is they were formerly used as lodge rooms for the Horseman's Word. And you can see some more examples here. Some have been unfinished. But again, they're quite deep. It doesn't quite come up in a photo, but practices where people have replicated the process in Britain talk about it taking roughly half an hour to 45 minutes of a candle flame and a spoon to produce the mark properly. Again, more here out at Smeaton. So talking about the Horseman's Word, again, a movement akin to Freemasonry, but one that had a lot more folk magic practices, a lot more rural, and certainly a lot more bawdy. Some of the oaths and things recorded belonging to the Horseman's Word, I can't really repeat in a public forum like this. They're quite graphic and rude, I'll call it, particularly since a lot of them refer to, I will say loosely, metaphors between training and riding a horse and meeting young women, I'll call it, in trying to be vague. And they're certainly quite graphic and rude, forming those sort of parallels. And they had a ritual where one was made to claim their traditions from Old Nick, which led to some claims of demon practice and that kind of thing in the 19th century by the papacy, which is not dissimilar to the same sort of claim made about Freemasons in that period. Talking before about soot markings, the markings underneath the Mechanics Institute are being recognised as kind of unique both to the country and quite extraordinary. And when you have a look at these marks here in the basement, you can see they've been carefully traced out in with a marker, then gone over with soot in enormous detail. They seem to date from about 1882. And interestingly, the marks have been put into the shape of the Eureka, the Southern Cross. They have references to the fallen. My suspicion is with this, at the time when it was actually being used as a winery, that it may have pertained to the Great Australasian Mine Disaster. However, this is speculation in my part. We certainly need to find some sort of reference in the literature to determine what they're on about. But it is interesting, you get some of these patterns. On the left here, we have what's called a demon trap from a church in Whittleford in Britain. And again, you can see these same patterns drawn in soot in the Ballarat Mechanics Institute. One thing that's important to note with these kind of practices as well is that it's hard to tell to what extent people believed it and supernaturalized it. If I talk to you about, for instance, traditions like saying something bad, touch wood, having a horseshoe upside down, floor 13, do people believe it? And one of the interesting things, and this is also reported in literature by people like George Ewart Evans, is this kind of an interesting mix where people feel both uneasy about violating older traditions and customs or not following through with them, yet do they necessarily literally believe? And it's quite a complex mix where those traditions still have a strong emotional hold, yet Western education, a scientific approach to the world is also gaining traction. It makes it a very convoluted network, which in a sense people still grapple with today. And you get it here again, you can see the sheer scale of the soot marks on the Ballarat Mechanics Institute roof in the basement here. Here's some examples of hinge marks down at Slat Creek, that is. In British literature, the three marks here were meant to represent the Father, Son and the Holy Ghost, the Holy Trinity, and the X to block the entrance of evil spirits and bad luck. Here's another one in Bacchus Marsh, and you can see it's almost identical. We've talked about this already. Again, the interesting prevalence of things that occur, and it's quite interesting when you talk to people involved in the building industry just how often this kind of thing actually occurs. Now, this is found in a house on Erard Street in Ballarat. Underneath the hearthstone in a wooden area, we have a mummified skeletal cat and what looks like a witch bottle with a nativity scene on the front and undetermined sort of objects inside it. And again, its position under the hearthstone and the fireplace is significant. Again, a central part of the house and also those points that mark the entrance and exits to the home. One thing that's a really interesting legacy of these sort of practices and one that's perhaps a bit more easy to research is the traditions associated with birth calls. Now, this one here belonged to Camille Evans, which is actually Ian Evans's great grandmother. And inside it, she kept the birth call when she's born. That's the skin, the amniotic sac that surrounds a baby when it's born. And it would be carefully preserved, and the belief was that it would protect people against drowning. And there was actually quite a market for this. And if you go through Trove and look at birth calls and infant calls, you'll start to see, as you can see in the bottom right corner here, classifieds where they're sold and they're often worth quite a lot of money. There's also articles about people becoming angry where they realise they'd been duped and the birth call wasn't really from a human, it was from a calf or it had been artificially made somehow. And it's really interesting where this is quite well discussed, where they talk about, you know, values ranging from £5 to £10. So it's an interesting sort of legacy where you see the strength of these kind of traditions surviving. And one of the very fascinating things is why did some traditions survive and others seem to dissipate throughout the 19th century? And certainly what we've found in our archaeological survey was that the older the home, the more likely you were to find these kinds of marks and traditions and practices. We've talked a little about shoes already, but one of the interesting ones is, of course, poppets and dolls, an iconic representation of the human body. And again, finding them placed in the walls of the home, creating a spiritual connection between who the doll's meant to represent and the person who made it. And particularly when you look at the arm of this doll here, you can see all sorts of little carvings have been made along the wooden piece of, along the wooden arm here. Again, this doll placed in its own little concealed compartment in the floor, in this case from a heritage home in Western Australia. So let's talk a little bit about the people who practice this. Now, in Britain, the term for these people were cunning men and cunning women. And it's interesting, Ballarat, of course, had its own cunning woman, a lady by the name of Mary Barrell, who lived in 25 Lexington Street and sold her wares in the cemetery. Now, the cemetery itself is very significant in this respect because cemeteries are where you get a lot of objects and artefacts used in these kind of rituals. For instance, lead taken from a building in a cemetery could have curses inscribed on it or blessings inscribed on it and used to protect. Flowers from a grave were seen to have great significance. A hangman's hand was believed to cure all sorts of ills. So Mary Barrell, we investigated her with, there's a few different options of where she came from, but in either case it looks like she was an ex-convict who came here in the 1850s. She was abandoned by her husband, or her husband died. We're unclear because of the nature of records of the goldfields. She certainly thought of herself as abandoned. And she began to practice her wares selling cures to young women, particularly servant girls, across Ballarat. And there was quite a bit of a scandal around Mary Barrell, where she was practicing fortune telling, she was selling curses, she was selling cures. At the same time, she was still collecting funds from the benevolent asylum as an abandoned woman. A man by the name of John Ryan took extreme umbrage to her practices. You can say here, the woman's been carrying on her game for over 20 years, and the amount of misery she causes in the neighbourhood, and so on. His particular gripe was he claimed that his wife and other married women were seeing her and she was telling them things that they were getting up to that they claimed wasn't true. One occasion, John Ryan's actually arrested for attempting to murder Mary Barrell and savagely assaulting her. He claimed to come home and find the fire out and the house unkempt because they'd been off seeing Mary Barrel. In her case, it ended up attracting a lot of attention in the Ballarat Star and Courier, where James Odie was advocating very strongly that she should be cut off from the benevolent asylum. James Curtis, of course, noted spiritualist and quite progressive, arguing that she should still be able to practice and receive funds. When she died in 1896, there was a procession of women who took her to her grave, a spot purchased by James Curtis in the Episcopalian part of the cemetery, yet her gravestone was desecrated after she died, and now it's a blank area. But it shows a sort of sign of strength of feeling and the kind of role these people played. Now, in terms of the actual practices, this is where it can be really interesting. We only have fragments of what Mary Barrel said she did, things like witch bottles and so on. However, Benjamin Noakes, who was a former convict sent to Port Arthur, later on became a publican, and he maintained a spell book at the end of his almanac. And his spell book was recorded by William Allison, who also practiced this kind of folk magic practices. And you can see here, for instance, a certain charm for rheumatism, a certain sacred charm. In this, we have recipes for witch bottles, magical charms people could wear, curses to send against people who had taken your partner or caused you to lose your job or made your cattle sick. We get a sense of the kind of practices people had. For instance, we have a spell to enchant a nail to hammer into the ground so that the next person picking it up will receive your back pain. Making a witch bottle, taking it down to an open body of water, holding it against the current, and when the urine in the witch bottle had flown away completely, that it would protect you against pain in childbirth. Now, we're quite fortunate these records have been digitised, and you can actually access them here and have a look at the kinds of folk magic practices we had in early colonial Australia. Now, presumably there would be differences between them and differences based on where people came from, but also synergy between them because they communicated and shared practices and traditions, which is a very significant part of the process. And it also gives us a bit of an insight into the way in which the working poor came to terms with living in a foreign, what was to them a foreign land, and adapted their own particular folk practices from Europe to Australia. And again, which things survived, which things did not. So when you're looking for these kinds of things, and we're always keeping our eyes open, there was recently one we came across in Collingwood recently, a hexafoil that had been carved into a former doorway of what was a stable house turned into an outhouse. You know, these things still pop up. So places you find these, they're thresholds. You find them on entrances and exits to the home. Chimney pockets, fireplaces, windowsills, corners of the roof, doorways, under doorways. Something I've not mentioned today, of course, is finding the skull of an animal placed under the doorway. Ian Evans found a unique find down in Tasmania of 6 arranged Tasmanian tiger skulls placed under the doorway to a home. And to keep your eyes open, and when you see them, to report them and bring them forward. I'm just going to, before I just move on to this, show you another little example I came across last year. If you look at this miner's pick, for instance, and I'll see if it can come up here, that you can see someone, it's been restored and de-rusted and so on. You can see the pentacle that's been carved into it and the VV for the Virgin Mary. And again, these fragments that are around. It's kind of fascinating in one respect. My earlier research was based at looking at the witch trials in Britain, and it's interesting in Australia what you find are these sort of residue fragments from Europe, where some have continued, some haven't, and it's continued to evolve and shape. Though what's interesting in Australia's context is that by the 1890s, for the most part, this had died out, whereas in Britain, some of it continued significantly longer into the 1950s, at the times when George Ewart Evans was making his recording. So just moving through to just to wrap up again. When you find these marks, there's a few things that'd be great when you report them. Of course, the address of the property, when it was built, has it been renovated or relocated? If you know anything about the history of the property, that's really helpful, or the previous owners. And of course, contact details. The research process is ongoing despite COVID causing a 1.5-year hiatus. So you can send it to Ian Evans at ahiddenculture@gmail.com or to myself, and I can forward it across. And our hope is to be able to do a full national survey of these surviving folk magic practices as remaining in these heritage buildings across the country.